such a full room today to even see people standing, because it certainly indicates a very good audience. In this, our opening session of panelists, the plenary session on globalization and the Caribbean. It's my honor to have been asked to chair and organize this session. My name is LOCKSLEY EDMONDSON. I'm a native of Jamaica, a political scientist by training, an internationalist by inclination, and currently director of the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University. I'll be introducing the rest of the panel in a moment. But again, I want to, on our collective behalf, to thank very much our hosts here in St. Kitts, even those of us who have been here for just a few hours less than... The last plenary I did was in St. Kitts. Please forgive me. It's really true. Here in Grenada, how could one ever forget it? When I flew in last night from Barbados, late last night, to Grenada, I only thought, of planes coming in from Barbados 9 years ago. The whole memory came back. When I landed at the airport, memories and images were revived of its geopolitical and even economic meaning. Here in Grenada, we are so much reminded in terms of events not too long ago of both the inspirations and failings of Caribbean and Third World leadership, of both the imaginativeness and the irresponsibilities of Caribbean and Third World leadership. We're reminded that this little island was such an important scene in which East-West rivalries were being articulated and fought out and at times imagined, and where North-South challenges remained and still remain as a very important issue. But we're also reminded not only of Grenada, but also of St. Kitts and the wider Caribbean, historically how this area has been an arena of great power competition and rivalry, the historic Caribbean. And this morning, in getting up early and going to the beach and looking out at the sea, the tranquil sea, one could only remember how that tranquility disguised a stormy geopolitical history, that behind that tranquil sea were memories of the racial and economic atrocities associated with the transatlantic slave trade. And when one saw some boats in the distance, fishermen I assume, one only began even to imagine 500 years ago some other ships finding their way into the Caribbean with a fellow called Christopher Columbus and others, and the Caribbean being the gateway to Euro-Western dominance on the origins of the present inequitable global system that we now inherited and now inhabit. It was interesting to look at the panels for this particular C.S.A. session and not see any which seem specifically to address the Columbus factor and the Columbian legacy. I suppose one could say that it is all implicit in our deliberations today. It certainly is implicit in, I think, what the panels here are going to try to do today. But I think it's very important for us to use this particular occasion 500 years later to pause and reflect not only on the Columbus meaning and legacy, but of the meaning of the Caribbean in this whole scenario. A region which we know was the laboratory of Western imperialism and the incubator of modern internationalized racism. A region whose globality is well represented spatially in terms of the fact that its dominant political economic systems were constructed by Europe, while the dominant socio-cultural systems originated in Afro-Asia. a region which at once is the critical link between the New World and Afro-Asia, and indeed the link between the two Americas. A region which occasionally has suggested some promises of an internationalist ideal, but more often than not has mirrored the seamier side of international and global history. So here we are in Grenada, very appropriately addressing the theme of globalization. And we are very fortunate this morning to have a panel not only very academically and intellectually distinguished, but institutionally very well located. It is a sheer accident, you know. It turns out that we have two past presidents of the C.S.A., a soon-to-be president of the C.S.A., and one vice presidential contender. In fact, your chair here today, me, I'm the only one out of that particular institutional scenario. But welcome to you all, and welcome to our panel. Now, one of the papers being presented today by Jorge HEINE, past president of the C.S.A., a professor of international relations at the University of Chile. His latest book is entitled A Revolution Aborted, The Lessons of Grenada, published by Pittsburgh University Press. He's going to address the theme, Europe and the Caribbean, going bananas over the Seine.
Thank you, LOCKSLEY. Much of the discussion on European-Caribbean relations has focused on the effects of the single European market that is planned to be implemented on January 1st, 1993, on the Caribbean economies. It's not just technology, it's also nature that is conspiring against this panel. The question being, of course, what will the Caribbean do now that the hitherto preferential access to a number of European markets will change and will be more restricted? Again, of course, this cannot be seen solely in terms of what is happening in Europe. What is happening in Europe is part of a broader process, something that relates to the globalization of the world economy, which gives the title to this panel, which relates to the liberalization that we are seeing and the negotiations that are going on in the Uruguay round, that relates also to what is happening in North America with the emergence of NAFTA, and what some consider to be, although this is more questionable, a sort of trading zone that is emerging around Japan and East Asia. We have had quite a number of conferences on the topic of Europe in the Caribbean, a number of them sponsored by the West India Committee. And one wonders often about the effects of these conferences, whether in fact the many conclusions and papers and things that emerge out of these sessions have any perceptible effect on what policymakers do and governments do. We often would like that to be the case, but as I say, one often wonders. In that context, it seems to me, it is important to frame the discussion about the significance of European changes for the Caribbean, and, as I would argue, get sort of the sense of the times right. What I would like to set forth this morning is that, unfortunately, much of the discussion about what is going to happen with Lomé, what is going to happen with the preferential quotas and the other arrangement that exists between Europe and the Caribbean has not been set in the context in which we can really understand what is happening in the 90s and the direction we should take in the 90s, so that the Caribbean is able to overcome the severe difficulties and economic problems it faces today. In this context, it seems to me, it is important that we look at what I would like to call the sunset industries, of which bananas, it seems to me, as one classic case. And what we might call industries of the future, activities that promise and are, in fact, have the potential and the reality to make the Caribbean go into the 21st century with the sort of economic underpinnings it needs. That's the reason for the title of this paper. This again, of course, has to be set within the context of the Lomé agreements and the Lomé framework. A framework in which the Caribbean has played a very important role. One could be argued against out of proportion in terms of the numbers of members. You know, it's the African states, of course, that provide a majority of the members of the Lomé agreement, and that were sort of the original driving force behind the Lomé agreements. I remember the discussion in the early 80s when the Caribbean Basin Initiative was first set forth, and a number of people compared the Caribbean Basin Initiative with the Lomé agreements. The argument being at the time that Lomé provided a much more progressive and forward-looking relationship between the metropolitan countries and the Caribbean than did the CBI. And the argument there was being made that in terms of transfer of resources, that in terms of the various programs of cooperation and aid that were being set up, Lomé provided a lot more than the somewhat meager resources the CBI was considered to provide. Looking back, sort of 10 years after President Reagan's speech before the OAS, in which he announced his program, I would argue that it is not longer so clear that a comparison between Lomé and the sort of things that are behind the CBI on the one hand, and now President Bush's Enterprise for the Americas initiative, leaves Lomé standing in such good light. If one looks at the figures of trade, particularly of trade, but also others, between Europe and the Caribbean, and what the Lomé Agreement has fostered and has promoted, what we have is a situation of essentially declining trade, and rather than fostering trade and greater exchange between Europe and the Caribbean, Lomé has provided the framework for a declining type of relationship, one that has really not helped the region as much as we would like to. If you look at some of the figures in this regard, the ACP countries provided the EC with 20% of its developing country imports in 1975. 13 years later, by 1988, that figure had been reduced by 1/3 to mere 14%, although in that period the ACP had increased its membership from 46 to 66. According to some figures, 99% of ACP trade is declining, not surprising in view of the fact that the most dynamic sectors of the world economy include services and manufactured products rather than commodities, which provide the bulk of ACP trade. Now, in this context, you look at the discussions that have taken place between the ACP countries and Caribbean countries and the European leaders. And I'm extremely concerned about the sort of discussions that are going on, because I do not see the sort of forward-looking dynamic approach that is needed to lift the region from its present condition. The suggestion was made, for example, in the discussions of leading up to Lomé IV, that Europe should provide price and access guarantees for ACP manufactured products. Now, I don't know, a quota for Congolese cars. I don't quite see that as the way forward, or as something realistic given present conditions and trends in the world economy. The basic problem we face is that commodities are no longer the key to the trade between Europe and the Caribbean. It used to be, and this was sort of the initial approach that was followed in Lomé, that Europe was extremely interested in dependent on commodities produced in the developing world, and therefore it was interested in some sort of arrangement that would guarantee it access to these commodities and raw materials. More and more, as you will know, raw materials provide a less significant part of the total product of the developed countries. A lot of their activities are oriented towards services and the type of technological products that require a lot less in terms of raw materials input. And therefore, it is not surprising that ACP trade and Caribbean trade is declining and is facing severe difficulties. To that, the generalized response has been to try to lock in additional agreements. There's the sugar agreement, of course, that has now a permanent status. But the idea has been, well, we lock in other agreements. And the problem there the biggest problem there, of course, has been with bananas. There is this wonderful quotation I came across of a British bureaucrat that said, the banana problem is the most taxing intellectually that I've ever come across in my life. And I mean, I suppose before this audience, I don't have to go into any detail of what this problem entails. It's basically, the fact that Eastern European bananas have had this preferential access to the British market. Presumably, if there is a single European market, that should stop in this very fragmented banana market that we have now in Europe, in which Germany, Germans are very big on desserts, imports bananas from all over the world. France imports them from Guadeloupe and Martinique. Italy from Somalia, and so on and so forth, should presumably come to an end. And at that point, the problem would be that Eastern Caribbean banana producers would be faced with a very difficult situation. Eastern Caribbean bananas are a lot more expensive than those from Central America, the so-called dollar bananas, and the possibility of competing with them on a sort of level ground is considered problematic. And as I say, a tremendous effort has been made to somehow solve this problem. As of yet, I understand there is still no solution to this very vexing question. And obviously, it is important to look at the figures of some of the Eastern Caribbean countries. St. Lucia, Dominica, St. Vincent are highly dependent on banana production. It's very important for them, and during the 80s it became even more so. The question becomes, though, it seems to me, whether sort of the banana problem, as it has tended to be, should become sort of the central issue in European-Caribbean relations, and whether policymakers and others, bureaucrats and so on, should continue to grapple with this, often leaving aside other problems, other aspects that it seems to me are more significant and more important as we get closer to the 21st century. By contrast, for example, anything that has to do with tourism receives very little attention in the Lomé agreement. I think there's some funding for a tourism school in the Bahamas, but over and beyond that, there's really very little in the Lomé agreement that has to do with tourism. Now, I would argue that the concerns of Prime Minister Eugenia Charles, who expressed it so graphically, and let me quote to you this part of her speech before the EC-ACP Joint Assembly in 1989. We must be prepared to pay starvation wages, experience runaway inflation, have currencies of no practical value, experience military coups and dictatorships, exploit our working people, and generally disregard the dignity and sanctity of human life. We must forget the legacy of democracy which Europe so kindly bestowed upon us and to which we have grown accustomed. We must, God knows how, change the geography of our countries and change our landscape, get rid of our hills, will away erosion, storms, and other such naturally occurring phenomena. This was an impassioned plea to the European community to take account the very special circumstances of the Caribbean and keep the banana agreement somehow working. Now, it seems to me, though, that the current situation, what it does, in fact, is sort of complete the vicious circle of post-plantation societies. Economies that were originally structured by the colonial powers to satisfy the needs of the metropolis find themselves now at the whim of these same metropolis to continue programs for which there's really no economic rationale, but for a variety of reasons are supposed to be important to continue. Again, on the question of bananas, for how long will British consumers be willing to pay the highest prices in Europe for bananas? It is unclear that it is something that can be continued on a more or less indefinite basis. It is in that sense, it is from that perspective, I would argue, that one has to look and stress the economic activities that have a much greater future. And in that sense, it seems to me that tourism is something that deserves a lot more attention than has been the case until now. Again, we all know the figures, and it is not doesn't make much sense to dwell a great deal on them. But there's no question that tourism is emerging more and more as the single most important foreign exchange earner in the Caribbean. Again, the question here, it seems to me, is in addition to developing all the mechanisms that have emerged, and I would argue that the work that has been done in that regard by the CTO, the Caribbean Tourism Organization, is especially significant. One looks at the figures, and it's really quite striking. Visitor receipts reach 85% of export earnings in Antigua and Barbuda, 63% in St. Kitts Nevis, and they go down up to 25% in Belize, Dominican, and other countries. But it's, and as some of you saw last year in Cuba, it is becoming also, I think it is by now the third largest earner of foreign exchange. Now, here it seems to me the question is, one argument that can be made is, why should governments be at all concerned with this? You just sort of let the free market work itself out and things will be okay. The fact is, and I would argue that this is where we have to put a lot of our energies in the near future. The problem with tourism is that much of tourist expenditure stays in the metropolitan countries. Some estimates say that not more than 40% of tourist expenditure is actually retained within the region. So you look at the numbers, it's vast numbers of people are coming, they're spending quite a bit of money. But the question is, how much of that money really filters down and actually stays in the Caribbean economies? It is in that sense that a whole array of issues that has received very little attention in the discussions with Europe, matters like airline landing rights and of that sort, become really quite central. The ability of use inputs into the tourist industry that activate the rest of the economy. That tourism is not the sort of enclave industry that is often accused of being. Is really quite important. And the sort of agreements that can be reached between Caribbean and the various European countries is in that sense extremely significant. And yet you don't see the sort of debate and closely developed argument on this aspect of Caribbean economic development that you do, for example, in the case of of bananas, although the figures are much more significant and the potential, of course, is much, much greater. Some estimates consider that at the beginning of the 21st century, maybe as soon as the year 2000, tourism will be the single most important economic activity throughout the world. Now, unless we understand that and are able to draw the necessary conclusions, we will find ourselves, it seems to me, in a very difficult situation. A recent communiqué of the West India Committee put it this way: the pace of change in Europe is accelerating. The danger of marginalization of the Caribbean is very real. Until now, the region's reactions has been largely defensive in an attempt to protect whatever preferences the Caribbean has in European market. Although important, this is not enough. The push towards liberalization that we are seeing in the world economy and the possibility of an agreement in the talks of the Uruguay round is extremely important. And yet, there's this tremendous paradox. A number of people have told me that the Caribbean should be very worried that if there is an agreement reached on the Uruguay round, the Caribbean would be much the worse for it, because the liberalization that we would witness would in fact do tremendous damage to a variety of Caribbean economic activities. Now, if that is the case, and this is the trend that we are seeing throughout the world, there is a very serious problem. And unless this sort of being out of phase with the current trends we're witnessing in the world economy is somehow addressed, and policymakers and scholars and economists come up with a way of inserting Caribbean economic development into this sunrise industries, into the activities that have real potential, I think the economic difficulties that the region is facing will not be overcome. Thank you.